This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In 2015, advocating for the Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, then President Barack Obama argued that without an agreement that limited Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief, any U.S. administration hoping to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon would be left with only one option: another war in the Middle East. After pulling out of what he characterized as, quote, the worst deal ever in May of 2018, Donald Trump reinstated crippling sanctions on Iran. His administration now finds itself faced with a government in Tehran with rapidly diminishing economic or strategic incentives to maintain the terms of the agreement. In recent weeks, Iran has shot down an American drone, seized a British-flagged oil tanker, and been blamed by the Trump administration for an attack on two major Saudi oil facilities. Perhaps more significantly, it's poised to begin enriching uranium beyond the critical 20% mark, an important step towards producing weapons-grade material. As tensions mount in a region already riven by numerous conflicts, will the hawks in Washington and Tehran have their way, or can a new agreement be found that will dial back the likelihood of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East? To help us explore the implications of a collapse of the JCPOA for the region and the world, we're joined once again by Joseph Cirincione, president of Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation. Joe, welcome back.
Thank you, Doug. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I think it's been a while, so perhaps a good place to start is just to describe what exactly the JCPOA entailed.
Sure. This was the alternative to going to war with Iran. Either you're going to overthrow the regime or you're going to make a deal with the regime. So after months and months of arduous negotiations, they first stopped the program in its tracks. That was the interim agreement that they reached. And then they reached a comprehensive deal to shrink the program to a fraction of its former size. Iran was forced to rip out thousands of centrifuges, to ship out all the gas that they had enriched uranium gas, out of the country so they couldn't jumpstart a program, suddenly bolt out of it and start building material for a bomb. They had to agree to the most intrusive inspection regime ever negotiated, with seals and inspectors and cameras everywhere so we could be sure they weren't cheating. And finally, they had to pledge to never pursue nuclear weapons, to give up that option completely. They did all that. In exchange, the West and Russia and China, who were part of this agreement, agreed to drop the sanctions, to start admitting Iran back into the Western and global system of finances. All went pretty smoothly. They did all that, and we did release the sanctions, and the Cold War between the United States and Iran started to thaw a bit. But then Donald Trump repealed all that, as you mentioned, in April of 2018, and now we are back on a path towards war.
So significantly, as you alluded to, this was not a bilateral agreement. It was Iran and
the European Union, Great Britain, France, Germany, negotiating with Russia and China. This was a comprehensive global agreement. And then the whole thing was formalized at the United Nations in the UN Security Council. And that, in fact, is the binding document, what the UN Security Council resolution says.
So significantly, there are really sort of three tiers of sanctions that were given relief from in this agreement. There were the UN sanctions, the EU sanctions, and the US sanctions. So one thing we heard a lot about at the time was the impact of the agreement on breakout time.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what that is.
Sure. Everybody remembers Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, coming to the podium of the UN and holding up that Wile E. Coyote cartoon. He made the front pages of every paper in the world with that thing. It was great a great stunt. But he was right about what he was warning about. He had a picture of a bomb, and he showed it filling up with uranium, and he showed how Iran's capability to make the stuff of a bomb, not the weapon itself. They did not have an actual bomb program like we did, a Manhattan Project. No, they were just making the uranium and enriching it up to fuel grade. And then they said, well, stop. The problem was, once you get that kind of capability and you have enough centrifuges and you enrich it to high enough levels, it doesn't take very long to start going all the way up to bomb grade. And that was the risk. And he estimated that Iran would soon be able to make a bomb's worth of material in about 2 months' time. And that was correct. That was correct. Now it's about 2 years' time. So we drained Bibi Netanyahu's bomb. We eliminated the ability of Iran to break out and race for a bomb.
So, you know, as you suggested, it seemed to be going quite well. Talk a little bit about implementation day, January 2016.
Yeah, that was when the deal was completed. That is, in between the signing and implementation day, Iran did everything it was supposed to do. We weren't going to lift our sanctions. We weren't going to drop these sanctions until we were assured that Iran had done its part. Most people don't know this. The deal was front-loaded. So they had about 19,000 centrifuges. The deal said you can only keep 5 of them. So you had to rip the rest of them out. They had a plutonium research reactor that could make plutonium. The other material you could use for a bomb besides enriched uranium. They had to pull the reactor core out, drill it full of holes, and fill it full of concrete. They had hundreds of kilotons, hundreds of tons of uranium gas that they had enriched. They had to ship it all out of the country. They did all that and agreed to have the inspectors come in with seals and cameras and place all that. They had to do all that. The one flaw in this deal is that we didn't take pictures, that we didn't have pictures. So most Americans have never seen that happen. It's like it's invisible. And the reason is the Iranians were embarrassed by this. They didn't want their own public to know how much they were giving up. But I'm telling you, this was one of the strongest anti-nuclear deals I'd ever seen. And when they did all that, then and only then did we come to implementation day, and that's when the West and the US and the UN formally lifted the sanctions.
So, the political environment is constantly shifting here and elsewhere, and along comes Donald Trump in 2016. And he had run on this idea that this was a terrible deal, as I mentioned a little earlier, the worst deal ever. And so some of the things he pointed to is that it failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program, it failed to address Iran's proxy warfare in the region, and it had the sunset provisions would allow them eventually to go back into the bomb business. So was any of this really the intent of the agreement? I mean, you can hardly fault it for not addressing things it was never meant to address.
Right. That's like criticizing a campaign to eradicate polio because it doesn't also eradicate tuberculosis. Well, it's not designed to do that. It's designed to do one thing. And here's the reason why. I had dinner with President Rouhani, the president of Iran, shortly after he was elected. And he came to the United Nations in September of 2013, and that's when we started the negotiations. And we were meeting with a group of philanthropists and think tank leaders that we'd brought up to New York. And we pressed him on why not make a complete deal? Why not do that? As they say, the slogan was, go big for big, like Nixon goes to China. Let's settle everything, the Israeli relations, the Saudi relations, your support for Hamas and Hezbollah. And he says, the history of U.S.-Iran relations is very complicated. The table won't bear the weight of all those issues at once. So we've decided to start with the nuclear. And that was the right decision. That was the right decision. We wanted to get at the most important one, the one that threatened us the most. It didn't solve the ballistic missile program. It didn't solve their support for Hamas or Hezbollah. It didn't end the regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But all those other problems are much more manageable if you don't have a nuclear program in the background. That was the strategic reasoning. It was sound. If we had stayed the course, I'm convinced that we could have gotten to those other issues.
Well, one of the reasons we didn't stay the course is there's certainly a sizable element within the American political scene that that felt that, you know, we had them where we wanted them, and
Yes.
now it's not the time to lighten up. And I will read you, if I could, a quote by Senator Tom Cotton in his criticism of the JCPOA. He said, "These were the toughest sanctions Iran had ever faced in the run-up to the agreement, and they helped drive the regime to its knees. One thing I learned in the Army is that when your opponent is on his knees, you drive him to the ground and choke him out. But President Obama extended a hand and helped the Ayatollahs up."
Ah, you see. So there we have it. I thank the senator for the crystallization of that alternative point of view. And that point of view is that all our enemies should be treated like the Japanese at the end of World War II. That it's unconditional surrender. You come on the deck of the USS Missouri and you surrender. Well, if that is your standard, you're not going to make many agreements. You're going to have some very long wars. And that is really the difference between the people who supported this Iran anti-nuclear agreement and the people who opposed it. There's a small group in the middle who do quibble about the terms, and it could have been a little tougher here, and maybe the negotiators, but that is minor. The real opposition is that the people who never wanted to make a deal in the first place. You know, when Dick Cheney was asked during the Iraq War, right after we succeeded in overthrowing Saddam Hussein, about the possibility of negotiating with other countries like Iran or North Korea, he said, "We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it." And that's the mindset that Tom Cotton still has, that the point of U.S. power should be to overthrow these regimes, to impose our will on these regimes, or as he puts it so eloquently, to choke them to death. And that is a very costly and very difficult path, as the continued wars in the Middle East have shown us. The Iran deal was the antithesis to that, was a way of getting most of what we wanted when nobody dies and it didn't cost us a dime.
Well, subsequent to our walking away from the deal, the Trump administration has suggested some broad outlines of what might be a viable deal. And many people have said it looks an awful lot like the JCPOA. So what do you say to the line of thinking that one of the main things that made this deal so unpalatable to the Trump administration was that it was the Obama deal?
There's no question that that was probably the major factor. I mean, yes, there was some continued resistance to the deal from Bibi Netanyahu. There was grumbling about it from the Saudis. But, you know, even people who were against the deal while it was being negotiated, members of the Senate who didn't want to see the deal, were telling the president, look, keep it. It's sound. It works. The Israeli military and intelligence leadership were saying, keep it. It works. It has solved our problems. Even the Saudis were saying, look, I think we're better off with this deal than without it. So it really got very personal for President Trump, and it was part of his anti-Obama scrub. He thought he was Rome, and he was going to raise Carthage and leave no vestige of the Obama legacy and then salt the earth so they'd never grow again, and which is why you see case after case of him going after environmental regulations, the climate accord, the health care accord. Even a modest arms control agreement like the New START agreement is now sort of on the death list because Obama negotiated it. So unfortunately, this personalization has really hurt our national security.
Well, as we mentioned a little earlier, this was not a bilateral agreement.
Yeah.
And so even without the U.S., the agreement exists in some fashion. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about the status of the agreement right now.
Yeah, so the deal is alive. The U.S. pulled out. Actually, there's no withdrawal mechanism, so there is no pull-out. What we did technically was violate the deal. We reneged on our promises. We imposed sanctions. And remember, we're not putting sanctions on Iran. We don't trade with Iran. We don't sell anything or buy anything from Iran. What we're doing now is putting sanctions on our friends and allies who do. So we're telling Europe and Japan and India and China, if you buy Iranian oil or Iranian carpets or pistachios, their three main products, we are going to sanction you. If your banks lend money to Iran, we are going to sanction you. And the other countries resent this. It's the imposition of our foreign policy on them. We are making them do what we want. And these are our allies, remember. but they feel they have no choice, because when you come right down to it, they do a lot more business with us than they do with Iran. But they're trying to keep it alive. The Europeans are trying to find ways to give Iran some of the economic benefits it was promised and keep them in the deal, because they recognize it's better to have a contained program than an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program. The JCPOA is still on life support.
And significantly, we've seen where Iran has breached it with limits on the stock. It's very little that they couldn't walk back pretty handily.
Right. So the good news is, well, the bad news is that Iran is breaching the limits of the agreement. The good news is that they're not breaching it by very much. So they haven't. It's not militarily significant. They are still a good 2 years away from the ability to make enough material for a bomb and to fashion it into a weapon. But they're taking the rheostat and they're moving it, and they're saying, oh, you want to wage economic warfare against us? You want to try to crush us? We will not submit. We are not going to give in to you. And if you want to know what we can do, take a look at this. And they do two things. One is they start slowly exceeding some of the limits. So they're allowed to keep, for example, 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. You can't do squat with 300 kilograms. It's not significant. But now they're going a little over that, a little over that. Are they going to get to thousands of kilograms? No, but they're heading in that direction. The enrichment level, they're saying, well, we're limited to 3.7%. That's fuel grade. Well, maybe we'll go up to 20, which is a different kind of fuel, which gets you a lot closer to a bomb. So they're doing it like that. And meanwhile, they're taking some military actions in the Gulf region to show that if the U.S. wants to play rough, they're going to play rough right back, and it's going to cost.
Well, and indeed, from the looks of the Iranian economy, the U.S. is playing rough. If you look at GDP is down 4% in 2018, projected to be down 6% in 2019. The rial has sunk by 60%. So, is there a blowback to this? I mean, if there's domestic Iranian political considerations as well, right? I mean, if things get too bad, what incentive does Tehran have to play ball, if you will?
Right. So two things have happened. One, the sanctions work. There is pressure on Iran. They are hurting. Their oil exports are way, way down. Number two is that has actually strengthened the hardliners inside Iran. So it's not the pragmatists, the people who made the deal with us. Iran is a complicated political system, and there's all kinds of factions. And what this means is that the hardliners, the people who said, see, I told you we should never negotiate with the U.S. You can't trust those bastards. They're going to renege on the deal. Sure enough, we did. And they warned that there's no dealing with the West. We have to further isolate Iran in the region. We have to build up our defenses. And those forces are strengthening, which is why you see some of the moderates. President Rouhani is still the president for the next year or so, trying to find some diplomatic out here. Not so much because they believe that Iran will collapse if the sanctions continue, but because they believe they will lose power, that and they're going to find a deal that's acceptable to some of the hardline factions. It's not a capitulation to the U.S., but it might be a compromise to the U.S.
Well, and it's a situation just rife with ironies and unintended consequences. One of the moves that the Trump administration did recently was to designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. So, that's a group we've got a problem with. But yes. The sanctions have so crippled the legitimate economy that this is not just soldiers in barracks. These are people who are intimately woven into the fabric of the economic life. So by creating a black market, aren't we in fact enriching the Revolutionary Guard Corps?
Right. The people who are hurt by the sanctions are regular Iranians who can't buy medicine for diseases now, for example, whose food supplies are getting in short in short supply. The people who benefit are the hardliners, are the Revolutionary Guard. Why? Because they control the smuggling operations. So you want to buy a Porsche? You can buy a Porsche. You just got to buy it from the Revolutionary Guard. You want to make some transfers? We can help you with those transfers. They're a Revolutionary Guard financial conduits. It's just a price for it. So ironically, these sanctions, which is supposed to bring Iran to its knees, are hurting the average person in Iran, are alienating the middle class from America, who anybody who's been to Iran knows that Iranians basically love America, and it's strengthening the hardliners, and the hardliners are getting more latitude to start carrying out some of these military operations, like, I suspect, the recent strike on the Saudi oil facilities.
Well, and Representative Jim Himes from Connecticut, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, said recently most of the activities that the Iranians are undertaking in response to our very aggressive posture in the region. So, right. Just to what extent are we, facing this blowback right. because of these policies?
There's no question about it. The Iranians, these people invented chess. They've been playing this way for a very long time. This is a very educated country, 80 million people, very sophisticated. There's a manufacturing base. They make cars in Iran. It's the only country in the Middle East that makes cars. And what the Revolutionary Guard, I think, is doing, and what the hardliners are doing right now, is sending a signal to the West. You think you're going to squeeze us? You think that you're going to deliver a military strike that's going to take us down? Let me show you what we can do. And this very limited, very calibrated strike against the Saudi oil facilities, which was certainly done with Iranian-supplied weapons. We don't know where exactly. I'd be surprised if they came from Iran, but they were certainly Iranian-supplied. That just crippled a very healthy portion of the Saudi oil production overnight with very basic, almost impossible to defend against weapons. And that was just a taste. Talk about a rheostat. They're saying, look what we can do. You want some more of that? They could take out the Saudi oil supply if they wanted to, and none of the $168 billion a year that Saudi spends on weapons, on military budgets, is going to be able to compensate for that. So we strike Iran, they strike back. Almost certainly, the oil supply to the Western world, to the world, is disrupted. Almost certainly you get a global recession because of that. Almost certainly Donald Trump is not reelected, which I think is one of the major factors that stayed his hand when he was, by his own account, 10 minutes from sending missiles into Iran in retaliation for the drone strike.
Locked and loaded, to use
Locked and loaded. And he backed off at the last minute. Why? Because of that very basic economic and political calculation.
So talk a little bit, if you will, about that dynamic, the U.S.-Saudi relations and how that plays into this. Donald Trump famously said after the attacks, we're waiting to hear from the kingdom as to what they believe was the cause of this attack and under what terms we should proceed. So there are a lot of people that said, are we really waiting for the Saudis to tell us how to respond?
One of the most bizarre aspects of the Trump administration is that he seems to have contracted out U.S. national security policy to the Saudis. So and it's not a secret. He's saying it. We're waiting for the Saudis to tell us how to proceed. I don't know, I'm sure. No president has ever said that. No president has ever kowtowed to a foreign leader like that. Is it his private business dealings? Is it something the Saudis have over him? Is it a question of the billions of dollars of contracts? Remember that famous check he held up in the White House when he met with Mohammed bin Salman, the murderer of Mr. Khashoggi? I don't know for sure. And maybe this will come out as the impeachment proceedings continue, because the conversations that the president had with the leader of Ukraine are not the only conversations that have been put in a highly classified server in the White House. So are his conversations with Mohammed bin Salman and with Vladimir Putin. I suspect we're going to learn a lot more about the conversations and about these arrangements before too long.
Well, we've got just about a minute left. I'd like to end on a sort of more forward-looking note, if we could. How do we salvage this relationship?
The Iranians may see an advantage here to President Trump's troubles. They may calculate, I think correctly, that he wants to make a deal. We know he tried to meet Mr. Rouhani when he was at the United Nations. There are now press reports that it's actually close to some kind of agreement between Rouhani and Trump. I suspect that Trump's eagerness to have some kind of foreign policy victory may lead him into making a deal with Iran. The flip side of that is that his recklessness, his erratic behavior could lead him, and maybe with Saudi help, lead him into an ill-considered military strike that can plunge us into war. Both of these are real possibilities. Neither is certain. Both are possible.
Well, certainly one to keep an eye on. Joe Cirincione, thank you so much for
Thank you, Doug.
joining us once again.
My pleasure.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.